I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the, amazingly, this shows you the magnetic attraction of our guest on this webinar. There are more than 300 people who have signed up to attend, and I hope, at least registered, and I hope many of them are in fact actually attending, because this is going to be an unusually special webinar in a number of different respects. But before I get into that, my colleague Lisa Lee, without whom the Southeast Asia program at Stanford University, which incidentally I happen to administer, my name is Don Emerson, I happen to administer the program. Lisa reminded me that with more than 300 people watching and listening, I hope, it might be useful to mention to them that if you want to receive notification of future events that are sponsored by the Southeast Asia program, inside the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, it's like sort of boxes within boxes, right? Inside Stanford University, please feel free to check the program and you just type in Southeast Asia Program Stanford, and that'll bring you to the site. And you can even, if you don't mind, give us your email address, which we promise not to abuse, and you will be receiving messages that indicate future events. And it's not as though we have events every week. No, we're not quite that industrious. But you will then be in touch with us, and we hope that that will be to your benefit as well as to our own. Linda Lim, Professor Linda Lim, University of Michigan. Absolutely unique, and frankly, I have to admit, and hopefully this won't give you the sense that I have lost my objectivity. Linda is a friend and is a long-standing friend. I admire her greatly on a number of different levels. I will not rehash her extensive curriculum vitae. You've learned a little bit about her, those of you that are not otherwise familiar with her record, simply in the act of signing up for this webinar. There was a summary of her bio, and I will leave it at that to save time, but also because I want to do something else. I want to introduce Linda Lim with an anecdote from our friendship many, many years ago. And when I give you this anecdote, it will indicate to you how much I admire not only her perspicacity and her knowledge, but her acuity and her, how can I put it, her bravery in a way of taking positions that may not necessarily match the positions of the people that she is interacting with. And to me, that is the basis for scholarship. There has to be some back and forth, some disagreement. Without that kind of back and forth, we really can't make progress. And the last thing that scholarship should be is a kind of mutual congratulation society in which admiration simply drowns out critical thinking. Because if Linda is about anything, it's about critical thinking. All right, many years ago, the University of Wisconsin in Madison, Wisconsin, I happened to be there at that time, and there was a seminar. And during the course of the seminar, a professor, a colleague of mine at that time, spoke about women's situation, the role of women in Malaysia, and complained that women in Malaysia who had previously been working in the agricultural sector, you know, the backbreaking work of planting rice and harvesting rice and carrying the bundles of rice and so forth and so on back and forth in the agricultural sector, were moving to the towns and villages to work in factories. And that this, my colleague said, was a terrible thing, because in the factories they could be exploited, at least in the agricultural areas, they were with their family and so forth and so on. Linda Lim was in the room at that time. And Professor Lim had this to say. She said, you forget that from their point of view, imagine that you were engaging in that backbreaking work in the agricultural sector, unpaid, by the way, no pay, no wages, no, nothing. And now you're a young woman, maybe on an assembly line in a factory, yes, in a city, you're making money, you're earning some kind of a wage, and maybe some of that money you send back to your family, which is great, and some of that money you keep because you use it as an investment in your own future. And lo and behold, you have autonomy, something that so many people do not have, especially people who are poor. And as I listened to her give this absolutely persuasive counter argument, I will never forget it. Obviously, I'm telling it to you now. And so this is the kind of person that we're about to hear from. The last thing I'll say about the webinar is that in a way it is very, and incidentally, because that is about women in Malaysia, I think it's appropriate to say that because today, after all, is International Women's Day. So that's another reason I'm trying to defend my use of the anecdote as by way of an introduction. And with regard to the content of the seminar, this is really remarkable because on the one hand, it's extremely narrow, and on the other hand, it's extremely broad. That is to say, it's narrow because it's about one country, Singapore. But it's broad, as you will see, because it covers all manner of topics, inequality, race, U.S.-China relations. And there will be some conversation as well about the situation in Ukraine and how that might affect Singapore's foreign policy and so forth. We'll get into that later. So time for me to shut up and turn it over to Professor Linda Lim from the University of Michigan. And I look forward very much to her topic, the challenges of race, inequality, U.S.-China relations, Singapore today. Linda, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Don. Yes, we have known each other a very long time. When you told me you were going to say an anecdote, a couple of other less flattering ones flashed into my mind. So I'm glad that that's the one that you did. So I'll start with inequality, as you suggested. And basically, I'm looking at race, inequality, and U.S.-China relations, because all three subjects have been very, very much discussed in Singapore for the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years. But in my opinion, there has been insufficient linkage of the three, race, inequality, and U.S.-China relations, and insufficient attention paid to their embeddedness in Singapore's economic model. I am an economist. I studied the Singapore economy since I was a graduate student, and I'm now retired. And so all these things are linked. With respect to inequality, Singapore, as you know, your audience may or may not know, is one of the most unequal of the high income countries in the world. And by the way, you can step in at any time, as you know. And there's lots of data on this, however you measure it. It's very unequal. And this has concerned economists for some time. The inequality is different from that in other countries for, you know, in a couple of, in its linkage to Singapore's economic model. What is Singapore's economic model? It's state-directed, multinational-led, export-oriented, manufacturing focused, and austerity obsessed. Now, those are 5 things. I'm going to focus just on the first 2, state-directed and multinational led. So economists' criticism of this model is because it has been input intensive. That is to say, Singapore has managed to grow very rapidly over many decades by basically increasing inputs to get more output, by importing capital, importing technology, but also importing skills and labor. And therein lies a problem. It has produced more with more inputs as opposed to producing more by using existing inputs more efficiently, okay? Particularly in the area of labor. So what happens in terms of inequality is that the importation of labor, low wage, low skilled labor from poorer neighboring countries, okay, contrasts with the importation of highly skilled global talent from around the world, which has to be paid global salaries. So you have this sort of stretching out of the normal income distribution itself getting more unequal, on either end because of immigration and transient labor. Some 40% of the labor force and 40% of the population is foreign born, with both the low skilled and the foreign talent at the high end. And this, of course, has an impact on race, on international relations, and as we emerge, U.S. China relations. Okay? So what is the political significance of this? So economists have talked about this, for a long time. Well, in 2018,
Linda,
yes,
Linda, could I just interrupt?
Sure.
If you don't mind, before we leave this topic, I don't want to spend too much time on the kind of technical sort of statistical aspect, but on the inequality side, depending upon what you think of the Gini index of inequality, which I'm sure as our listeners know, the higher the index, the more the inequality. In 2021, last year, then Finance Minister Heng Swee Keat said that Singapore's Gini index at 0.375 was the lowest, that is the least unequal, that it had been since the year 2000. That would have been 20 years, 2 decades, right? Due, he said, to massive government transfers to lower income Singaporeans. And at the same time, if we look the comparison with other advanced economies, maybe this is an unfair comparison. The United States and Singapore are two radically different sizes and so forth and so on. Nevertheless, the American Gini index, which I took the liberty of looking up, at 0.484 is the highest that it's been according to the U.S. Census Bureau in half a century. So at least now that's unfair, right? That's not a random sample, that's Singapore and the U.S. But how persuasive do you think that statistic is? I mean, should we pay attention to it or?
Oh dear, I hope this doesn't open a whole separate talk. Okay, so, Gini, there are 2 types of Gini coefficient. One is the market-based one, and what sort of naturally, and then the other one is after taxes and transfers. The 0.375 thing refers to after taxes and transfers. And I don't know which year he was referring to, but if it's 2020, it would be huge transfers because that was due to COVID. And you had just, so I wouldn't consider 2020 to be at all a data point that you would compare with the previous 20 years. It was an exceptional year. So that's one thing. On the comparison, and I could go into this a lot more, but the comparison with the United States, that number for the United States sounds to me like pre-taxes and transfers. Okay, but even more interesting, Singapore, if you compare with a whole bunch of countries, and whether it's pre or post taxes and transfers, actually is the most unequal, except for 2 countries, the UK and the US. Okay, and I might, if I remember to, come back to this much later in my conversation about the characterization of Singapore and the US economies. Like, do you want to be like the United States, right? So that's a whole issue. So, but I'm happy in Q&A to talk about the detail more, but I'm afraid it might bore some people. Okay, so the economic inequality has been there. There's lots of discussion by economists. We can go into other measures of inequality, such as wage share of income, consumption share of income, percentile shares of national income, and all that kind of thing. But what was interesting was that in 2018, Nanyang Technological University sociology professor and my academia SG colleague, Teo Yu Yan, published a book called This is What Inequality Looks Like. And that book, in 4 years, has sold nearly 40,000 copies. Now, any book by an academic that sells 1,000 copies, particularly in a tiny market like Singapore. Okay? And what does this mean? I think the significance of it, of course, she writes beautifully and everything, and just tells the stories of families, doesn't just give data, shows that this was not just a subject of interest to economists, but it resonated with a large segment of the reading public. So it became a big issue. Coincidentally or not, later that year, the Minister of Education said that inequality was a national priority in Singapore, and he gave us the reason that social stratification had decreased social cohesiveness. So the government put its stamp on it in 2018, saying this is a major social problem. There was all kinds of hand wringing and chest beating about the emerging class divide, including on the government side. Then in 2021, no less a person than the governor of the central bank, Ravi Menon, the managing director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore, mused in a public lecture that perhaps Singapore would have to implement a minimum wage, unemployment insurance, which is among very, very few, if any, rich countries which doesn't have it. Singapore does not have this. Nearly everybody else does. And he even threw out the concept of a wealth tax, which most countries don't have. Okay? Mm-hmm. So I don't know what the reasoning was, but this was a big thing. And then the Prime Minister in his National Day speech that year also said, we will take care of low-wage workers. Now, what had happened along the way from 2018 until 2021 was also in 2020, there was an election, a general election, and the government lost a few seats, which for them, it's like a big deal. In Singapore, it's a big deal to lose a few seats. And this could have been an issue. The political opposition has long advocated a minimum wage, for example. And it was kind of interesting because 2020 was a COVID year. And typically Singaporeans rush flight to safety to vote for the PAP whenever they're faced with some kind of stress. So in the annual budget, which happened to be a few weeks ago, the government did what everybody had been, well, at least the opposition had been telling them not to do, which was it announced it would increase the regressive goods and services tax. There are lots of good reasons to have a consumption tax, but in the Singapore context, it was felt that it was unnecessary because there are many other ways of raising revenues. They did have a small increase in the top rate of income tax for the top 1.2% of income earners from 22 to 23%, which is still very low by international standards. But there was no increase, there was no capital gains tax. There isn't a capital gains tax. There was no increase in corporate tax. There was no significant increase in social welfare entitlements. So after all this time, there was still not enough that would make a significant dent on inequality, which is rather extreme by rich country standards. Okay? So, and we can go into that. So the philosophy of the government on this, and which I think Singaporeans bought for a long time, and I think it might be changing, is that the poor earn low wages because their individual productivity is low. Okay, you are not earning much because you're individual, and therefore the solution to that is state subsidized skills training, right? And there's no recognition or no acknowledgement except on Ministry of Manpower website where they do mention this, which is that wages are low because of this massive influx of low wage labor from other countries, which is the result of government policy. So the low wage worker, her wage is low because she has to compete with people from much poorer countries, or as they say, Singapore is a place where you can have first world living standards, okay, with third world wages. And it's one of the most expensive countries in the world at the same time. So that's inequality. which we can go into. Where does race factor into this? And so I don't know how many of your audience will know this, so I'll go into it a little bit. Singapore is a highly racialized economy, society, and polity. Right? Every Singaporean is assigned a race at birth, which must be one of four. Chinese, 75.9% of the population, Malay, 15%, Indian, 7.5%, and other, 1.6%, which we know in Singapore as the CMIO framework, Chinese, Malay, Indian, and others. This was established by British colonialists back in 1921, 100 years ago, 101 years ago. And these ratios that I mentioned were fossilized at the time of Singapore's independence in 1963 or 1965. Okay? So everything in Singapore, you know, the population is managed, including through immigration, to maintain those ratios. And this racial category doesn't just appear on your identity card, but is actually used for things like your public housing allocation, schooling. It factors into selection of electoral candidates and group representation constituencies in the reserve presidency, etc. The net result of this is, as a result, Singaporeans associate race with identity and are habituated to see many things through racial lenses.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
In that context? Obviously, the birth rate of different communities is relevant.
Yeah.
So are you suggesting that every year there is in effect an annual census so that you can take into account shifts in the birth rates of the various communities to maintain that rigid percentage division, CMIO?
Okay, that's difficult to do, like say every year you must have it, but that's definitely the target. Birth rates for, I believe now all groups are below replacement, but the Chinese birth rate is the lowest. And what it does is it's adjusted by, on the immigration side.
Right.
Okay, on the immigration side. So there's a lot more immigration of, in absolute numbers, of Chinese to try and maintain that ratio.
Right.
If you didn't have any immigration, then the Chinese share would fall over time. But it's a very strange thing. You assign this race even if you're biracial. So very slowly things have changed. Something like 18% of all marriages in Singapore are between two different races, but the child has to choose one, not both. Okay. So, you know, and I think it used to be always the father, but now you can choose the mothers too. But once you've decided that you're Chinese, even though your father was Indian, right? I mean, or your mother, something like that. I mean, it's kind of weird. Anyway, so one of the questions in people's minds is why? Okay, why do we need such a rigid the system decided by British colonialists 100 years ago, and at the end of the ratios fossilized at what they were 100 years ago, and it doesn't seem to make economic sense, right? From an economist point of view, okay, you need foreign inputs, okay, you need foreign talent, but why didn't you just get the best person for the job, as opposed to, you know, and I can see this personally because among my own MBA students, those from China can get permanent residence like immediately without the MBA, and those from India, even if they're married to a Singaporean, like takes years, and they might never get it. It's so just even on an individual level, it doesn't really seem to make sense. So, you know, you wonder about this. And last month, February 15th, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong gave me a 50-year flashback when he made a speech in Parliament, where he extolled Confucianism and criticized India because many of its parliamentarians were elected parliamentarians, had criminal charges against them, including for rape and murder. Okay? Now, it's kind of stunning. Needless to say, the Indian government was upset. Many Indians were upset at this. And the race optics were particularly unfortunate because the context in which he made the speech was a debate about sending two opposition parliamentarian leaders, for criminal prosecution for allegedly abetting the lie of one of their former members of parliament. So two opposition leaders, a former member of parliament, all three were ethnic minorities. So it was the optics was really like weird. And what this did was it triggered my recollection of attending a commemorative lecture by Lee Kuan Yew at his alma mater, Fitzwilliam College, Cambridge, in November 1971, when I was an undergraduate studying economics there, which I did. People might be surprised to hear this. I was motivated in large part because Singapore had been kicked out from Malaysia, and Lee Kuan Yew said something like, "Pray God, my successor is an economist." And I didn't know what an economist was, but after I got into the subject at my A levels, and I decided that's what I was going to do, not because I wanted to be prime minister, because girls didn't do that kind of thing then or now, but because I wanted to help in Singapore's economic development. This has motivated my whole life, right, whole career. And in particular, to ensure our survival as a sovereign nation. Anyway, I went to this lecture, and you can look at it at the lecture part in the National Archives, and the title was "East and West, the Twain Have Met," but not in the actual script of the talk, but I recall vividly in the Q&A, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew advanced what he called a sarong theory of development. Sarong, the cloth that you tie around yourself.
Right, right.
And most of the talk had been about why East Asians, particularly Japanese at the time, this was 1971, did so much better in economic development than South and Southeast Asians. And his theory was that South and Southeast Asians, because they wore dhoti or sarong, had to constantly tie and untie their sarong as they crossed over the buns from one rice field to the next. But Japanese and Chinese wore trousers and so could move faster. I couldn't believe this. I was so mortified when the British students came up to me and said, "That's your prime minister." They knew I admired him. So it was kind of like weird. But this was well before China had taken off, right? It's like a 1971. But the interesting thing is this was not a one-off reflection of Lee Kuan Yew, who was always focused on cultural and therefore racial roots of economic development. Well, 10 years later, he invited some Chinese American scholars to Singapore to set up a Confucian studies program in the schools, which was subsequently abandoned. I met with them at the University of Singapore. And this then spawned an Asian values discourse in the 1980s and 1990s, which you may remember.
I do.
The discourse has receded in academia long since, but from time to time, a politician or pundit will pop it up in Singapore. Okay, so it's sort of like in the backdrop. So underlying this whole Asian values discourse, and I think persisting, even in recent discussions, is an implicit association of race with patterns of behavior, such as work ethic, academic and entrepreneurial acumen and achievements. So I believe that clinging to these colonial era characterizations and ratios reflects a belief that the Chinese can make a superior contribution to the economy. And therefore, they are privileged in terms of quotas for immigrants, 7-1 versus Indians, for example. Okay, that's just putting a lot of things together. That's what I think. Now, one of the things on race in Singapore is that we're known for racial harmony and successful multiculturalism, right? So like, why am I talking about this? And so there's a tendency for some people to associate these racial ratios with that. Okay, I don't buy at all. There are many reasons for racial harmony, but more interesting from my point of view right now is sure, there's not been much any racial violence in Singapore since the 1960s. And the ratios, when there were race riots in the 50s and 60s, just a few, were same as today, so it can't be the racial, right? But we've had in recent years increased racist incidents, particularly in 2021, and particularly against ethnic Indians. So much so that in his National Day speech last year, the same one, Prime Minister said that we will be passing a Maintenance of Racial Harmony Act, like there is a Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act, a Sedition Act, and so on. So it remains to be seen whether it will, what it will be, and whether it will reduce or hopefully remove the job and housing discrimination that ethnic minorities face. Everybody agrees that they face this, so we can get into this. Of course, it didn't help that a few years ago, a senior minister said Singaporeans are not ready for a non-Chinese prime minister, even though they had one in the 1950s, a Baghdadi Jew elected in the 1950s, but apparently we're not ready. And even though the top vote getting and most popular minister is an Indian Singaporean, right? So there's lots of like, I guess you call it cognitive dissonance. So what explains the recent, so my interest now is what explains the recent increase in racist incidents. COVID was blamed. The people were stressed out over COVID. They lost their jobs and they blamed, foreigners for bringing in the virus or whatever. But I think that my argument is that this is linked and has always been linked with the economic model, with its heavy reliance on foreign labor and expatriates, particularly South Asians at both ends of the labor market. And this coincided with the belief that Indians in IT and finance were unfairly outcompeting Singaporean professionals, managers, executives, and technicians for jobs. So inequality within a resident population is bad enough, but political sensitivity to it increases when those seen as causing low wages at the bottom and benefiting from inequality at the top are of a different race from the majority. Okay? So I'm just describing the situation. So you can see now how this is going to play into US versus China.
Good.
Our attitudes towards US and towards China. But let's start with the economic model. China is Singapore's largest trade partner in merchandise trade. Okay, we're part of China-centered global supply chains, etc. But the US remains and has long been the largest foreign investor in the country. At the same time, Singapore is, of course, a very services-oriented economy. And we do a lot more trade in services with the US, with Europe, and with Japan than we do merchandise trade with China. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that Singapore's rapid growth and development has come about because of its role as an intermediary, a comprador between the West and Japan and global markets, and then later regional markets. It's an agent of foreign economic interests, and also, of course, a beneficiary and an enthusiastic participant in the global, what is it called, international rules-based international order. So that's the way things are. So what happens now? Many people, most people, believe that China will ascend an economic power in Southeast Asia. And, you know, why would that be a problem? It shouldn't be a problem, because you can still trade with the West, you can still trade with China. Trump's trade war with China and Xi Jinping's more aggressive posture on the world stage, particularly South China Sea, those suddenly made it more difficult to be in both those spheres. So now I'm going to read very quickly, very small. As you know, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies does an annual survey of Southeast Asia, and in which it interviews elites, government officials, academics, business leaders, journalists, and other experts. And the 2022 just came out in February, and it showed that Singapore's elites are very worried by China's rise, more so than their ASEAN neighbors, and increasingly so every year. And I have a lot of the data, but I'm just going to highlight that only 4% were confident that China would lead in the rules-based order and international law, whereas 62% had confidence in the US doing so. Asked if they were forced to align the country with one power or the other, 78% chose the US, 22% chose China. Okay, so there was a lot of concern on the part of Singapore elites. At the same time, in June 2021, Pew Research, an American outfit, surveyed 17 advanced economies, including Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore, and about the US and China. And Singapore was the outlier. It was the only one of the 17 countries which had a more favorable view of China, 64%, than of the US, 51%. The median in the group of 17 countries was 27% for China and 61% for the US. Well, when asked whether it was more favorable to have economic ties with China or the US, the group as a whole, 27% said China, 61% said US. Singapore was the only one with the reverse. 49% said China, 33% for the US. Okay. So essentially what you have, Singaporeans in general are more pro-China and less pro-US than Singaporeans in general, than the Singaporean elites. I don't like the term of elites and mass, but I'm going to use it because just for convenience here. And Singaporeans are also more pro-China than people in other advanced economies. Okay, so that's how the US. This too, I link. This is subjective now, what people feel, right? And this too I link to the economic model. Okay, so if you think about again the theme of this talk, which is inequality, race, and the model. It is difficult to argue that the disparity between elite and mass opinion of US versus China is due to race, because everyone is Chinese. The elites are probably more Chinese, right? than everybody else. So there are lots of different reasons for this. You might note, for example, that because of the racial ratio, there are about 500,000 new immigrants from China in a population of 5.5 million, right? Because we have to keep bringing in Chinese so that they are 75.9% of the population. So this might skew some surveys. The Chinese obviously retain connections with their home country. For many of them, it's a business advantage. It makes sense for them to do so. And because there's so many of them, they don't need to integrate culturally and linguistically with the rest of the population. Okay? They read their own materials and so on. So this group could skew some of the data, right? Because they're in Singaporeans, but not in the elite of Singaporeans, not so much. And some of them, Singapore is a very Western-centric, English-speaking, business, education, social environment. So this group could come in and feel much less, may feel that they're disadvantaged, okay, or they're not accorded, they don't have the same job prospects and social status, because they're new Chinese, given the dominance of the English-speaking, Western-centric, particularly in the elite. At the same time, you have a cadre of older, locally born Chinese educated who have suffered the same discriminations, particularly the closure of private Chinese language schools, and of Nanyang University, the only Chinese language university in Southeast Asia in 1980. Okay? So there are groups who are not as comfortable, shall we say, in the Western-centric group. English is the lingua franca in Singapore. It is the language of the majority. Even the majority of Chinese, particularly in younger age groups. Surveys have shown that being able to speak English is considered a marker of national identity in Singapore, and being able to speak good English is considered a marker of higher socio-economic status. These are all from the Institute of Policy Studies. Okay? So what's really interesting then is, wouldn't this make Singaporeans more pro-US? I'm still trying to explain the Pew study, okay? This, why when the elites have a certain view. So we can go into the differences between elites. So elites are clearly much more, well, first of all, they're highly educated, which means Western educated. The economic model of state-owned, I shouldn't say state-owned, government-linked, sorry, that was a government-linked companies, which are very powerful in Singapore, and multinational companies, in the context of liberal immigration, they're allowed to easily employ workers from anywhere, right? And particularly for multinationals, it makes absolute sense. Instead of training locally, which might be uncertain, people could leave. When you have a spot to fill in a Singapore office, you just bring in whoever you can from elsewhere around the world. And that person, particularly for Western multinationals, is very likely to be a very Westernized person, not necessarily a white person, but could be Chinese or Indian Americans, for example. Okay? So we have a lot of, from Singapore's local immigration policies bring in a lot of people who then cause some tensions with locals. Okay, so on the one hand, you have locals, even English-speaking locals, you have Chinese-speaking locals who may feel discriminated against in the Western-centric hierarchy. You have English-speaking locals who are aced out by English-speaking foreigners. I mean, Filipinos, Indians, they might speak English better than us. I mean, I don't know. And then you have a simmering nationalist resentment among many middle-aged and older Singaporeans, including the highly educated, who have experienced unequal treatment compared to white, especially white Westerners in their own country. Okay, this began in the British colonial period. It continued through the Western multinational era. It's felt is perpetuated by very Anglo-centric government, once derided as banana man, right, and coconut and all these kinds of things. So you have, I mean, here we could go into lots of stories, right? Academia is rife with examples. We all had experiences with white privilege, particularly me, as you know, my husband is a white American. It's galling to feel that you are not equal in your own country. Okay? I mean, it's literally like everyday incidents. You're not being treated equally with foreigners in your own country. The government keeps saying we need foreigners because you guys are not good enough. I mean, that's the way it's perceived. The foreigners themselves say you guys need us, okay, because you're not good enough. I mean, it's a weird thing.
That's,
but
wait.
You know, it's
Linda,
subjective.
Linda, I mean, that's surely just a little teeny bit unfair. I mean, I think there are expatriates in Singapore who don't have those kinds of really unfortunate views. I mean, who are less perhaps egocentric in terms of we are God's gift to Singapore or something like that. So I think there is some variation there. And in terms of the Pew survey versus the ISEA survey, I guess one point would be that the gap, right, between those who pick China and those who pick the U.S. in the case of the Pew survey is less than it is in the case of the ISEA survey. So methodologically, I think one should perhaps keep that in mind. But the argument you make about, and also I should add that these are influencers, right? So Yusof Ishak focused on influencers. I mean, people who presumably would have some interest in, would definitely have an interest in, and also perhaps to some extent be involved in writing things and speaking and so forth about foreign policy issues. And so it's possible that the basis of the Yusof Ishak result is more narrowly focused. After all, China has been behaving, I think one might say, badly in the South China Sea, for instance. But how many people in the Pew survey are really concerned about the South China Sea, the way some in the Yusof Ishak survey would be? So I guess the main thing to say is that from what you've said, I don't think that you believe that there is enough tension between those two results to suggest that there is a desire in the ordinary public to undermine Singapore's policy, for example, of cooperating with the United States, simply because that base is more pro-China. I think you're not saying that at all, right?
I don't know. It's a very
really?
strange moment, okay? I'm setting out the economic model and how it feeds into some of these tensions, right?
Okay.
And how these tensions, which are sub-state, they're not in the public, right? And I don't want the few results of favoring China over the US, I wouldn't have considered, like definitive. It was one data point. It was one time, okay, and so on. But it did resonate with a lot of this more subjective, anecdotal stuff that I'm saying. Why would, I would think to myself, why would, Singaporeans, 60 or 70% of them feel this way? And that is not necessarily based on objective criteria, but rather on subjective experience. I'm not saying that all expatriates are like that. I'm
Right,
saying that because,
yeah,
or even that, in fact, not most expatriates are not like that.
yeah.
Many of them are my students. They're not like that. But the thing is that their presence in this hierarchical power structure creates a certain dynamic among different groups in the society, which makes race and West versus East, etc.,
Yeah, yeah.
a fact of tension. I want to add one more thing here before I go, which is that a lot of this sort of East versus West tension, which becomes important in the Ukraine stuff, which is what's got me excited more recently, is the result of decades of propaganda by the Singapore elite and the Singapore government about Asian values, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they keep saying we need, we are different from the West, and we have these Asian values, and what do Asian values mean? Well, they're not liberal values. Okay, they're not freedom of speech. They're not free press.
Mm-hmm.
They're not decadent lifestyles or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So Singaporeans have been habituated to think that whoever says we are anti-Western values. In other words, okay, we have been brought up to be anti-Western values which have been defined in a certain way, and okay,
right.
back to U.S. and China. There's been a whole discourse for several years now, right? Including in public media, social media, and so on, of fake news, misinformation. Many people think it's Chinese propaganda, right? There's a whole sort of anti-US, anti-West thing that's been going on. And in part, in reaction to that, what the government's policy has been to clamp down on information. So in 2019, they passed the POFMA, the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. Last year, they passed the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act, all supposed to clamp down on, nefarious forces, sort of anti-national, misinformation, anti-vaxxers, whatever. But in fact, it has been used disproportionately for, against, websites, civil society organizations, people saying things. Not overwhelmingly, but that was our fear, I think, of many academics, that this would be happen. So the point I'm making there is, if it is true that you're trying to overcome Chinese or Russian or any other kind of foreign fake news and misinformation, you don't become like them. I mean, that's my own fear. We actually become like them when we go towards restricting information. So I think the time is, I'm going to just very quickly mention how Ukraine fits into all this. Okay?
Yeah.
I mean, when we first set this up 6 months ago, of course, it didn't. But as part of this whole thing, one of the strange things that happened was before Russia invaded, there was this constant drumbeat of propaganda on social media chats and everything. And I get all this stuff, so I know it, right? So social media and Facebook, WhatsApp chats, videos, and you don't think too much about it. I mean, I know what happens. But what happened here was that this overwhelmingly, before the invasion and definitely after, turned into very anti-West, anti-US, and even anti the Singapore government's position on Ukraine, which you might want to remind your audience about it.
Yeah, right. Very briefly, let me quote what Singapore's Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan said recently. Quote, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a clear and gross violation of international norms and a completely unacceptable precedent. This is an existential issue for us in Singapore. A world order based on might is right, or where the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. Such a world order would be profoundly inimical to the security and survival of small states. That's what he said, which I think was, if I'm not mistaken, the most forceful statement made by any Southeast Asian country with regard to the invasion of Ukraine.
Yes. And Singapore has, for once put its money where its mouth is and doing sanctions and so on. So that was the official position. I think Ukraine shows the sort of ISIS and Pew gap, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the government took this very strong stand, and they seemed to unleash this incredible flood of pro-China, excusing Russia, virulently, I would say virulently, vehemently anti-West and anti-American online. Okay? And this is not from, I don't know, this is from everybody, bankers, doctors, English-speaking people, and so on, all English, and including diatribes against the racist white Western media, who would, in other words, people were turning against, sources, not just the Straits Times, which nobody believes because it's seen as a government mouthpiece, but also, New York Times, BBC, all these. Some people say we turned them off, right? It's like, so this is all sort of extremely interesting. And, maybe there were questions about it, but I just want to, there are like 5, I'm an economist, so it's a multivariate problem. There are like 5 or 6 reasons. I want to highlight 2, okay, which maybe because they fit in with my theory. So one is the culture of pragmatism in Singapore. The PAP government has made it a matter of pride and distinctiveness for Singaporeans to prioritize pragmatism over principle. Okay? And that's material advancement over individual rights or personal freedoms. That's us. That is like meritocracy, pragmatism is part of Singapore. That is us. We're used in a one-party, state to deference to authority, acquiescence to power. And so many Singaporeans believe that it's pragmatic to go along with the powerful, just like they've gone along with the PAP, right? So people have been saying online that Zelensky is irresponsible to allow his people to continue to fight when they're only going to lose. It's the same thing domestically. The people who make fun of dissidents in Singapore and say they're stupid, you can't win, why are you going to waste your energy? So there's this whole mindset and a whole culture. So when you have an increasingly powerful and assertive China, which you and everybody else believes will dominate your economy going forward, just accept it. Just go along with what China wants. I've even seen people say that Vivian, Balakrishnan, our minister, and the government is doing Singaporeans a disfavor by standing up so strongly for a principle because it will get us enemies. So that's one reason. The second reason is there's a conflation between the anti-West, pro-China, and anti-PAP sentiments, at least online, okay? In social media, including private encrypted WhatsApp chats and so on. And they come along with a package of criticisms of the PAP, including high ministerial salaries, pay for generals, foreign talent in Singapore. Okay? So here's what I think is happening, and I think it has deep historical roots. back to the state-directed, foreign investment-led economic model. Okay? The PAP government is seen as a comprador, enabling and favoring foreign multinationals, which together with government-linked companies crowd out local private enterprise. At the same time, because of its immigration policy, it brings in foreign talent and foreign labor, but particularly foreign talent, which crowds out Singaporeans in jobs, including professionals and so on. Okay? This whole foreign-centered, state-directed model fits in with with how segments of the population experience this economic model. Okay? They're not necessarily losers. Some of the people are extremely successful, okay? But they still feel that there is a state that, well, the high ministerial salaries. Okay? So there's a feeling that PAP pay themselves high salaries as ministers, as senior civil servants, as managers of government-linked companies, which you can become without any business experience, as board members. So there's this feeling that the spoils of the economic model are going disproportionately to the state and to foreigners enabled and brought in by the state, while we, the local Singaporeans, are disparaged, demeaned, whatever. We don't speak English well enough. We don't speak Chinese well enough, whatever. And so inequality comes, all the way we come back to inequalities. Inequality factors into this. When you have rich foreigners coming in, they appear to live the high life, etc. And the government, one of the things the government says all the time, which is we must be competitive in attracting foreigners, foreign companies and foreign talent. Flashback to the budget. That's why we can't raise taxes on corporations, because we're raising taxes on our foreign patrons or clients. Okay? That's why we cannot raise taxes on the high income, because we are the high income earners with our high salaries, all kinds of things. And that's why we end up raising taxes, on the rest of the population. Okay. So you get all this, and just very quickly, there's a social cultural dimension about this, and there's also an intellectual dimension, because there's a whole scholarship and rhetoric of post-colonialism and anti-imperialism, which feeds into this, which is not ethnic, right? It's not so. You can't say it's because people are Chinese and okay, speak Chinese language and culture. There's also post-colonial and so this, in a sense, the storm on social media against Ukraine is almost like a perfect storm.
Right, right. Well, this is fascinating. I really appreciate everything you've said. Extremely interesting, articulately put. This is an extraordinarily interesting exchange, I must say. It's time for the Q&A, and let me start with a question that actually is outside the bounds of the content of what we've just been talking about, and yet is absolutely relevant. And that is, who will become the next Prime Minister of Singapore, and who should be the next Prime Minister of Singapore? That's a loaded question if I've ever heard one.
One, nobody knows, and that's the problem. Nobody knows who will be the next Prime Minister of Singapore, because the grooming of the fourth generation leadership, the successor to the third generation, Lee Hsien Loong and so on, has already taken 10 years, and they're still not ready. So nobody knows. Okay, and by the same token, about who should be, I'm not a political scientist. I don't think anybody knows. We do know that there's obviously been some problems in the succession planning. Speaking as a corporate type, right? I mean, the big job of the board is to pick the CEO, right? And the next CEO and groom, and you have this whole succession process, but it cannot be 10 years, and it cannot be a constantly shifting group of people. Why does it matter right now? I think because, as the blurb for my talk, which I didn't 100% focus on, so is that we're in a very perilous situation, even before Ukraine, but especially after Ukraine. Okay, the path is not clear. The path, the economic path that we're on, has led to all these problems that will be very difficult to unwind. There is no obvious leader with a compelling message that would unite the population to bring us forward. So that's all I'll say for now.
Well, well put, I must say. The next question is this. One of the attendees asks whether, in your view, there is a possible contradiction between the meritocracy that I think Singapore's leaders claim it to be or hope it to be, on the one hand, and the ethnocentrism that might be inferred from the dominant demographic and perhaps also to some extent political role of the Chinese, the ethnic Chinese. Does favoring one undercut the argument for meritocracy, whereas favoring the other, and that perhaps might mean favoring expatriates, Westerners, and so forth? You see what I'm saying? The tension between the two. Is it there, or am I exaggerating? Or it's not my question.
Meritocracy is a huge subject in Singapore. And it is a huge subject because, everybody recognizes it has a role to play in the inequality, right? And the way that meritocracy is defined, particularly in terms of the state, which is in terms of academic achievement and things like that. So that's a whole Singapore specific thing. And part of the Singapore meritocracy discussion also reflects discussions in other countries like the America, right? Which is that who is best placed to succeed, right? The children of, the upper middle class professionals. So that's the discussion of meritocracy. If you're talking about bringing in, so that's meritocracy in a sort of hierarchical domestic context. If you're talking about meritocracy of locals versus foreigners for the same job, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, well, it's not clear. I'm just giving you the question.
Yeah. I see. It's not your question. It was from, yeah.
No, this is also in the chat. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay.
Q&A.
Yeah. Q&A. So that, in terms of I think that there's several things to be considered. The best person for the job, certainly from a business perspective, even in the US, we are much, much more, what would we call it? I wouldn't say flexible. Maybe it is flexible, where people are shifting, HR people, leaders, leadership trainers and so on, are shifting away from a very narrow definition of merit. So in the case of Singapore, I would say that if you have two people, okay, with equivalent qualifications for that job, right, then I think you should favor the Singaporeans the way that you do in America, right? If you want to get a visa here, you have to show that there's no foreigner that can do your job, right? So I think that you could do that. If the foreign person is clearly superior on very clear metrics, then I think that you probably should go with that foreign person, but you have, in that calculation, you have to take into account the likelihood of turnover. Okay? Is somebody who is better at this point of time, but in 5 years is going to leave and return to their home country, does that person give a larger benefit than someone who is local, who might not be up there, but is totally sort of acceptable? Okay, so there's a whole separate business hiring discussion that I'm not sure we should have right now, because it's kind of not within the purview of this talk.
We don't have a lot of time, so let me put together two questions, one of which would take us into philosophy, and therefore feel free to deal with it very briefly. That question likens Asian values to the Protestant ethic theory, and suggests that the Protestant ethic theory has not been disproven, which I guess is another debate. And therefore, maybe the Asian values theory should be taken very seriously, because perhaps it hasn't been disproven either. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but I certainly would not encourage you to go on at any length. I guess the other question, which is much more relevant to what you said, is this. You pointed out what might be termed a crackdown. I mean, maybe that is too harsh a term. That is to say, the effort by the government of Singapore to limit to keep the limits of discourse, including academic discourse, within a certain realm. I mean, I'm putting that very diplomatically. And so the question is this: do you expect that in future discussions of foreign policy, presumably by people such as yourself, will have out of bounds markers, OB markers, thrown around them, just as they are, the questioner says, now regarding domestic discourse on domestic policy? So will foreign policy be next?
Okay, let me take the first one. On Asian values and Protestant ethic, I'm absolutely not an expert on any of this philosophical stuff, but my own feeling as an economist and as a business, sometimes practitioner, is that these are not very useful concepts at all. Okay, I think I look at social forces, and as an economist, and I look at individuals as a business practitioner, and I'm just not sure what Asian values. I mean, what are Asian values, right? So I don't want to get into that. On the second one, that's much, yeah, it is closer to my own interests. I don't know what the government thinks or what they will do, okay, in terms of foreign policy discourse. I think the official line, government and universities, is that we totally have freedom of speech and freedom of expression, etc. Look at all these articles that people publish. Look at Linda Lim giving her talk and nothing happened to her. Of course, she's not employed there. So, and so on. So, I think that the controls in Singapore on discourse are very subtle. People usually call it self-censorship. You know the OB markers, okay? You grow up, nobody tells you what the OB markers are, okay? So to be safe, they might be here or they might be there, but you make them here, right? So self-control, self-censorship, much more restrictive than any kind of markers. Okay, so I think that that's the case. With respect to foreign policy, post-Ukraine, or even pre-Ukraine, I think with FICA and laws like that, I think there was a concern that a lot of the discussion going on is potentially prejudicial to Singapore's national interests, however defined.
Mm-hmm.
And in that case, then there is a justification for control, for censorship, right? For restriction,
right,
because it is your national security. I have a completely opposite view. Okay? What makes you secure? Lee Kuan Yew was very fond of the term cultural ballast, B-A-L-L-A-S-T, right? And he felt then 50 years ago, 40 years ago, that if we had Asian values, okay, we would not be corrupted or seduced by Western values, okay, conservative traditional Asian values. And then that's why he did a lot of things. I think we need intellectual ballast. Intellectual ballast means that to protect ourselves, we need to have more knowledge, not less, more information. We need to have a practice and a habit of rigorous critical inquiry, and that requires freedom. Okay, that requires a certain amount of, when you have discussion. I mean, it's really irritating to get all these frequently forwarded anonymous messages on your WhatsApp that people seem to believe.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
No, why are we paying attention to anonymous, why are we not having these discussions ourselves in open? Read stuff, discuss all your ideas.
Yeah.
If you don't have open discussion, it will go underground.
Right.
And underground, there are no controls on it. Okay?
Right.
It's much more scary to me.
Right. It's almost as if there had to be some kind of surgery to implant within the notion of Asian values, the notion of personal autonomy and personal freedom of thought, that is not a Western or Anglo-Saxon value. It's an Asian value as well, because it is a universal value. And I think that struggle has not really been consummated yet. Okay, two questions, if I could combine them. And I'm not judging I'm not saying whether I agree or disagree with any of the implications of any of these questions, but the question is this. Insofar as you have mentioned the existence of anti-American views in Singapore, how much responsibility for those views would you give, number one, to Donald Trump and what he did? And second, to the questioner says, the clear indication that in the composition of the leadership of the US government at administrative levels, Americans of Indian descent are more prominent, there are more of them, than are Americans of Chinese descent. Do you think that contributes to any kind of bad feelings, particularly presumably among the Chinese in Singapore?
What was the first part of the question again?
Well, the first part of the question was how much of this is Trump's fault?
Oh, yes. Okay. A lot, but not all. I mean, I think, remember my argument is that these tensions have been simmering for a long time and they're embedded in Singapore's domestic economic model. When Trump came along, it heightened certain aspects of it, including the racial aspect and so on. So I think definitely Trump and certain racist things around his tenure definitely caused, I think, some people to turn anti-American who were not. Okay? Mm-hmm. And on the Chinese, on the Indians versus China, no, I don't think so. I don't think it's a big deal. I think if you pay so much attention to the color of people's skin in the American, I mean, it's good up to a point, but it can be too extreme. Okay, like so in the Biden administration, let's say above a certain level, there's 10 Indians and 3 Chinese. I can explain that. Okay, but it's not. But I can explain that, and I don't think it is or should influence the way Singaporeans, Chinese think about the U.S.
Right.
Okay. Can I just say one more thing, because we're on the Asian values, which I forgot to say. This thing about Western values versus universal values versus Asian values. Okay? A lot of what people say are Western values are not that. And here I will refer to the work of my colleague, Marty Powers, China historian, who has shown that values such as democracy, individual liberty, social justice, rights to freedom of expression, and the obligation of scholars, educated people to criticize and challenge the government. He has shown that all of these appeared in China before they appeared in the West. And they're still there, okay? They may not be in practice in China today, but these values are not necessarily, are not Western. They may have been Western for like 300 years, but they were universal. And one of the very interesting things is the recent research that I saw of your Stanford colleagues, Jennifer Pan and Yiping Su, which is of public opinion polls of Chinese in China. And they showed that one, Chinese had, I think they called it, what did they call it? Multi-dimensional preferences. There's a diversity of opinion among Chinese. So you can't just say the Chinese feel this or Asian values see this. And in particular, that younger and better educated and higher income Chinese, urban Chinese, were more likely to be in favor of, to have liberal political views, to be in favor of pro-market economic policy, and to be less nationalistic, much less nationalistic in foreign policy. Well, interestingly enough, there's a survey in Singapore, much less, we showed the same thing from last year. That is, in Singapore, younger, better educated, and higher socio-economic status people are much more inclined to what we might call liberal values in politics, economics, and culture. And I forgot to mention that on the Ukraine thing, all the young people, that is below 30, that I consulted, it wasn't a thing for them. It was not on their chats. Some of them said, my parents, my grandparents, yes, but not me. That younger Singaporeans were not as vested in this anti-West thing over Ukraine. In fact, they seem to be a bit apathetic and not very engaged, which may not be good in itself. But there's a clear generational divide. Over 50, overwhelmingly, okay, anti-West. And under that, no. So I think that suggests to me that there is some convergence. I know that's a bad word because of recent history. There is some convergence in universal values, in China, in Singapore, and in ancient China.
In June of 2021, and this is my comment, this does not reflect the content of any question, although I want to link it to a question in the Q&A. This is my comment. In June of 2021, in the Straits Times, Kishore Mahbubani wrote a piece entitled, Asia, Say No to NATO. I mention that because perhaps there's an unintentional echo of that in one of the questions, which is actually a statement, and the questioner, I think, wants you to comment, agree or disagree with the statement. The person identifies him or herself as a Singaporean, but is otherwise anonymous. And the statement is that if the United States and the West had said no to Ukraine joining NATO, had ruled that out in advance, then the war could have been avoided. And to that extent, the US and the West must take some responsibility for the invasion of Ukraine. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, first, I know there's a ton of international relations theories around this. Secondly, this is one of the threads in all the social media things. What do I, being not an expert on this, know nothing about NATO, know nothing about international relations theory, although I know Kishore, for decades and so on. I just don't see the logic in that, right? I just don't see the logic in that. How can First of all, at several levels. First, Ukraine is a sovereign country. It can choose and should be allowed to choose its own international relations. Okay, number one. Two, Ukraine applies to join NATO, or actually more importantly, the EU. Okay. EU and NATO have a right to deny Ukraine on the basis of all the criteria they use. Like for join European Union is hard. You got to fit, you got to have, there's a whole bunch of criteria you have to, free trade, whatever. Okay, so if Ukraine applies and is rejected on the grounds of everybody else, yes, okay, that's fine. Sorry, Ukraine. I'm not sure that it makes sense, that it's a good precedent, that it's fair to say, oh, Ukraine, you actually fit all the criteria, but sorry, we can't let you in because Russia is going to bomb us. Who's the villain here? Right? Who's the villain here? Is it Ukraine, who, let's say, fit all the criteria and wanted it? Or is it someone elsewhere, who could say they're going to, I'm sorry, just in pure logic, I just don't get it. And
this question asks for a comparison of Singapore and Hong Kong. The questioner says that it would appear that high income inequality in Singapore has not translated into mass grievance the way inequality has in Hong Kong over the past few years. Why do you think this is so?
Many reasons. Because we are running out of time, I would say housing policy. That's it. Okay. Singapore has, mass housing at below market rates for a lot of, not for everybody, and so on. And the market, the land and housing market in Singapore is government controlled. In Hong Kong, it is not government, the government gives, it is tycoon controlled. Okay, I mean, there are a bunch of real estate tycoons, and so that's one of the reasons. But I think there are many other reasons as well, but that's my short answer.
Yeah, it's okay if we go over a couple of minutes. I have 2 minutes left on my watch. we won't spend too much more time, but there are a couple of questions I would like to pass on to you, if I could. And one of them, to take a kind of a positive note here, or let me mix two questions, and perhaps that would be the final question, this combination of two questions. One is, to what extent do you think that, and this is a presumption on the part of the questioner, to what extent do you think that the success, or at least the ability or willingness of American corporations to take racial justice and gender equality into account might influence similar behavior on the part of corporations in Singapore? And then the second question is this: to what extent do the problems that you point out with regard to public opinion and so forth in Singapore reflect a lack of attention to the need for civic education, presumably transracial civic education, starting when children are quite young, so that they could be brought up not necessarily being loyal to their particular communities with adverse effects on social consensus in Singapore, but have a greater sense of, and one is tempted to say democratic, but that's not the questioner's term, that's my term, citizenship in Singapore, democratic citizenship. Two questions.
Okay. On the first question, certainly corporations in Singapore, both multinationals and state or state-linked and locals, are considering those issues, not in the same way as Americans by any means, but simply in response to one, talent shortage, okay, the very small size of the domestic labor force, skilled labor force. So there's a lot of attention to things like more jobs for disabled people, for example. We have to use everybody, that we have. And everyone has very sophisticated, big corporations have fairly sophisticated HR policies and so on. So I would say it's not racial justice, the terminology doesn't fit. It's not it, but it's definitely a sense of anti-discrimination. We don't have anti-discrimination laws. We should. So there's a push for that. But there are definitely, I think, from a business point of view, intentions, not necessarily actions. And the intentions themselves may not be universal, to pay more attention to gender, race, disabled, sexual orientation, all those kinds of things. From a purely, it's good for my business, as well as it's the right thing to do. Okay, so I think that's true. And what was the second question again?
Civic education.
Oh, civic education. Oh, this is a big one. There's plenty of civic education in Singapore. The question is, what is it like? Is it propaganda, national education? What is the civic education? I think if we have, I think in a dominant party state with a state-controlled, state-directed education system, it's not easy to say what should be in the civic education, curriculum. And I also don't think that the way you get kids to be anti-racist or non-racist is to put them in a classroom or have role play or whatever and stuff like that. I think people learn to be non-racist by mixing with other races and growing up with them, living together with them, interacting socially with them and so on. And so I think I'm not at all an expert in this area, and there are experts in this area. So that's all I'm prepared to say. Yeah.
Well, that may be all you're prepared to say, but what you have been prepared to say has been extraordinarily stimulating and based on thorough knowledge, clearly argued. I cannot thank you enough. I've learned a lot from listening to you, and I dare say the attendees have learned as well. And I want to thank all of the people who attended, and particularly those that posed questions on the Q&A, to whom I apologize because I could only pose rather, and Linda could only answer some of them, but I appreciate your participation. And I also want to thank Lisa Lee, my administrative colleague here at Stanford, without whom, well, frankly, the Southeast Asia program would not exist. And certainly this seminar would not have happened as technologically, as feasibly as it did, and smoothly. And I really thank you so much, Linda. I really do.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed myself.
And I look forward to the end of Omicron and the beginning of the reestablishment of a face-to-face relationship. Either you come here or I go to Singapore or whatever.
Yes.
And
okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thanks everyone. Okay, thanks,
so much.
Lisa.
Take care.
Yeah.
All the best.
Bye.
Bye-bye.